Have you ever reached out your hand, smiling, believing you were being welcomed, only for the other person to pass you by as if you were invisible? That moment when your hand lingers in midair isn't just awkwardness in front of a crowd. It's a blade slicing into your pride. For many Black people, it's never just a handshake denied. It's an entire history dismissed, a cold whisper saying, "You don't belong here." But what if one day, that very hand once refused becomes the one holding the entire game? What if the silence once mistaken for weakness turns into the sharpest weapon? This isn't just a story about Nia Hawthorne, a Black CEO stepping into a room full of white billionaires. This is a story about reversal, about the moment the world thinks you're at your smallest, and that's when you shatter every expectation. And here's the thing, what happens next isn't a fiery speech or a loud rebuttal. It's like flipping the board in silence, delivering an answer so precise that the person who caused the humiliation is left frozen in their own hall. A twist no one in that room could have imagined, except Nia. Before we step into that journey, I want to invite you to walk with this channel. If this story speaks to you, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next reversal. And don't forget to ring the notification bell, because sometimes just one moment is enough to change the way we see justice and dignity. And now, let's return to that night. An opulent conference, blinding white lights flooding the banquet tables of the proud elite. Amid the clinking of crystal laughter, Nia Hawthorne walked in, extended her hand, and in that instant the world revealed its true face. Nia Hawthorne stepped through the towering double doors of the Grand Marlowe Hotel, where the annual Billionaires Summit was underway. The crystal-lined ceiling glittered like a star-studded sky, hundreds of chandeliers pouring light onto banquet tables, draped in flawless white linen. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed with self-assurance, and every gaze snapped toward Nia. Not with respect, but as though she were a blot of ink bleeding across a carefully pressed canvas. At the front sat the familiar row of confident faces. Silver hair slicked back, watches gleaming, half smiles curving at the corners of their mouths. They nodded, trading glances like members of a private game to which Nia was not invited. She moved forward, posture upright, eyes calm. A perfectly tailored black dress framed her strong figure, each step landing soft yet steady on the marble floor. When she drew close, Nia extended her hand. Just a brief, ordinary gesture. A handshake, nothing more. But Gregory Vale, the man many called the unofficial throne of the billionaire class, only flicked his eyes over her before sliding his hand into his pocket. He turned instead to the man on his right, clasping him warmly, laughing loud and long, as though Nia were air. For a moment, the room froze. Then came the murmurs. Raised brows, smirks tugging at lips. A photographer's flash cut across the hall, catching Nia's hand still suspended in midair, alone, untaken. She withdrew. No anger, no protest. Only the thinnest smile so fine it was hard to tell if it was serenity or sting. Her dark eyes swept the room, steady, dissecting every face. The host's voice, syrupy sweet but laced with disdain, broke the air. "Please welcome CEO Nia Hawthorne of Aurora Group to the back row." Back row. The words fell like a gavel. Those seats were for assistants, technicians, the not important enoughs who stayed out of the spotlight. Laughter rippled from the tables, white eyes gleaming with both glee and curiosity. Nia walked on, not rushing, not faltering. But each step sounded like a march against the wind, heels striking marble with a dry echo, a reminder that rejection can thunder louder than applause. She sat in the last row where the light only half reached, where shadows covered more than the chandeliers revealed. Yet in that dimness, her silence burned brighter than any spotlight. While the room busied itself with champagne toast and staged handshakes, no one noticed the weapon quietly forged in her stillness. Because sometimes the hand refused becomes the one that topples the table. And that night, no one suspected that the woman shoved to the back row held the very card that would decide their fate. Her hand had hung there, in that invisible space between her and Gregory Vale. He hadn't needed words. That small act had turned the entire room into a silent trial. Then, like a pre-scored symphony, the snickers began. Not loud, not in unison, but sharp enough to cut. Like silver spoons scraping crystal, delicate, piercing, cruel. Vale swung around again, gripping another man's hand with both of his, clapping backs, roaring with laughter. It wasn't just disregard, it was a statement. You are not one of us. You will never belong here. Every clasp, every chuckle turned the evening into farce, and Nia had been cast as the outsider. The host beamed like he was announcing a prize winner. Please, CEO of Aurora Group, take the back row. He lingered on those words, back row, as if they were not just about seating, but about place in society itself. Whispers rolled across the room. Some bent over their glasses to hide smirks. Others turned to glance at Nia, eyes lit with the thrill of witnessing a public diminishment. Crystal rang against crystal, the cold soundtrack of the powerful reaffirming themselves. Nia's response was simple. She drew her hand back and laid it on the sleek fabric of her dress. No rush, no bitterness. A small nod, quiet but deliberate. The kind a keen observer knows means she won't forget this. Not to lash out immediately, but to bide her time. In this world, silence was not surrender. Silence was a promise. She walked to the last row, her heels tapped soft, punctuation marks and a tense score. A CEO relegated to sit among the water carriers and stagehands, a billion-dollar woman sent to the shadows. And yet, sitting there in partial dark, Nia's eyes glowed. She looked toward the stage, toward the glittering teeth and hollow laughter, and in that cruel split between front and back, the hall turned into a mirror. It reflected not her fall, but their cracks. They thought they had humiliated her, but humiliation often sets the stage for the sharpest reversals. Because sometimes when you think you've laughed the loudest from the top, all you've really done is build the backdrop for the act that hasn't yet begun. Nia smiled faintly, ambiguous enough to pass as acceptance, deep enough to unsettle. She settled into her seat like she hadn't just been slapped in front of hundreds of eyes. Around her, the crowd buzzed, each person writing their own script. She's finished, she's embarrassed, Aurora Group is done. Nia smoothed her dress. One hand rested lightly on her knee, fingers tapping a rhythm only she seemed to hear. Her calmness unnerved them. Why not storm out? Why not rage? Why not break? Their whispers grew, feeding on her restraint. Someone muttered mid-row, "She thinks she belongs. That seat in the back is exactly where she does." The words floated to Nia, sharp and clear as a church bell. She didn't flinch. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat as though holding onto a secret, then opened them again, eyes fixed, piercing the stage. To the others, the chandeliers, the laughter, the glitter meant affirmation of power. To Nia, it was circus. Handshakes were acrobatics. Compliments were hired applause. And from the back row, she could see it all, the cracks invisible to those basking under the front lights. Gregory Vale clinked glasses, shaking hands, chest heaving with his own laughter. He believed she was diminished, that every gaze belonged to him. But he didn't know that from the shadows, Nia had stepped outside the play. She was no longer cast. She was the audience. And her thin, unbothered smile whispered a quiet warning. Today's refusal is only paint. Underneath, another script is being written. They thought she bowed her head. But sometimes you bow not to yield, but to see your pieces clearer. And in that moment, when the whole hall believed she had lost, none of them realized the real game had only just begun. Nia's chair sat stranded in the very last row, wedged near the staff, adjusting microphones and balancing trays of champagne. The perfume of luxury drifting from the front had given way to the heavy smell of coffee and the hurried steps of workers backstage. From there, she looked up at the front row, a stretch of gleaming suits so blinding they resembled marble pillars, convinced they had the right to sit at the center of the world. There were the famous faces, Fixtures of financial magazines, hair slicked with precision, gold watches flashing at their wrists, movements practiced in the confidence of men who believe they rewrote the rules. None of them turned back. Why would they? The back row, by habit, was invisible. The front row was where power was assumed to live. The back row, in their eyes, was nothing but background. Nia leaned slightly into her chair, listening to the overlapping laughter, the sharp clink of glasses colliding into a gaudy harmony. They weren't laughing because anything was truly funny, but because laughter itself was a code, an admission ticket, a signal that we're in this together. And of course, Nia was not. For a moment, she studied every face. That confidence wasn't pure power. It looked more like a mask stretched to hide the fear of losing privilege. The nods, the half-smiles, the repeated affirmations, a chorus line in an old, tired orchestra. Up front, friendship was measured not in trust, but in stock valuations, sealed with overlong handshakes and sugar-coated grins. In the back, no one pretended. The servers murmured quietly about duties, their eyes sometimes flicking toward Nia with a mix of curiosity and unease. They too could see it. The open imbalance of a black woman CEO, head of a global empire, placed beside them like an afterthought. Nia didn't shrink. She observed with calm detachment, even a hint of irony. Because sometimes the back row offered the widest view. From here, she saw the tremor behind fake smiles, the worry behind polished bravado. The back row wasn't for losers, it was the balcony seat with the best view of the play. A thought crossed her mind, bitter, sharp. They pushed me from the light, but from the shadows, I'll see them clearer than they see themselves. The hall grew louder, laughter climbing higher as if to drown out her existence. But Nia's gaze stayed steady as though she was recording every detail, every move, every shallow display. And it was from that lone chair at the edge of the hall that the real play began to reveal itself. One man in the front row suddenly stood. His white suit gleamed under the chandeliers, drawing heads toward him. He spoke louder than needed, his lips curling into a half-smile. "Not everyone belongs at this table," he announced, savoring the words. "Some people are born to serve it." Laughter burst open like a drum roll. Not laughter for humor, but laughter as a boundary line. They laughed to prove they were of the table, while anyone in the back row was condemned to the margins. Nia sat motionless, the glass of water before her untouched. She didn't turn her head, didn't change her expression. Only her eyes shifted slightly as if photographing the scene for later. Her silence didn't mute the insult, it amplified it. A few tilted their heads, stifling chuckles. Others stared straight at her, waiting for a crack, a flinch, a retort. None came. Only a composure so unnerving it turned the joke back on them. A blade had been thrown, but without a visible wound, it simply dangled in the air, exposing the weakness of the hand that cast it. A journalist scribbling at the corner smiled faintly. He saw what the others didn't. Perhaps that back row seat had given Nia an advantage. She had the whole room in her sight line, unclouded by staged jokes and velvet handshakes. From the head of the table, Gregory Vale lifted his glass, eyes flicking to the back row. That glance carried smugness, a reminder. Remember your place. But Nia didn't return it. She only turned her glass so the light caught it, throwing a silver streak across the table. As if she was playing her own game, one they couldn't touch. The laughter ebbed but lingered like smoke in the rafters. They thought they had witnessed humiliation. But Nia's stillness in the last row, her unyielding silence, was itself an answer. I saw your little circus, and I remember. That night, none of them knew that the phrase, "born to serve that table," would return like a knife in the dark, cutting the very mouths that had just laughed. Then, just as the noise calmed, the giant screen behind the stage flickered on. Bold letters glowed. Top 10 companies to watch. Music swelled like a coronation march for the chosen. The front row straightened, bracing for names they already assumed would be their own. The first name appeared. Thunderous applause. A rising energy company. Its CEO stood to a wave of congratulations. The second, the third, each greeted with ovations that crashed like surf. The host's voice dripped with enthusiasm, pouring more champagne into already full glasses. From the back, Naya's eyes locked on the screen. She didn't blink. At the sixth, seventh name, her palm pressed slightly into her knee. Tension coiled under her skin, but her face stayed calm. To anyone watching, she was detached, but inside each name not Aurora Group was a blade, cold and deliberate. The 10th name appeared. Applause erupted, relentless. Then the screen went still. The list was complete. Aurora Group had been erased as though it had never existed. Silence rippled across the hall. Then whispers rose, laughter tucked behind hands. A few heads turned back, eyes sparkling with cruel delight. At the front, Gregory Vale smirked, clinking glasses again. He didn't need to say it. His glance said everything. This was no accident. This was the cut we planned. Nia stayed seated. Her hand rested on her glass, fingers tapping a slow rhythm. A small gesture heavy with intent, as though weighing silence against a counterstrike. But she didn't rise. She didn't protest. Her gaze slid past the screen and settled on Gregory's smiling face. If anyone watched closely, they'd see Vale's smile wasn't flawless. His eyes carried a flicker of unease. He knew. Erasing a name from a list wasn't the same as erasing a company from reality. But the room saw only what it wanted. Power triumphant, silence defeated. Aurora Group vanished from the screen. Yet in Nia's eyes burned something untouchable, a strength that required no applause, no list. That night, they thought they had closed Nia's chapter. In truth, they had opened a new one, where the woman exiled to the back row would force the whole hall to turn and face her. The red-carpeted corridor of the Grand Marlowe Hotel became a temporary refuge for whispered exchanges. Brass chandeliers cast golden light over tilted heads and voices that sounded harmless, but cut sharp as blades. Nia walked out, her step steady as if she only wanted to breathe air different from the thick atmosphere inside the hall. Yet she didn't need to strain to listen. The words reached her anyway, clear as if someone had pressed them directly into her mind. Aurora Group is going under, a man's voice muttered. Gregory just leaked the numbers, a woman replied, softer but with a chill of certainty. The words drifted in the air, but for Nia they landed like daggers between her shoulder blades. She didn't stop, didn't turn. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curved into a line that could mean anything. People whispered rumors in hushed tones, but inside the mind of the target, every rumor sounded like a trumpet. She knew this game well. When logic can't remove someone, the shortcut is doubt. A doctored spreadsheet, an inside source, almost a conveniently timed article, all it took to turn a stable company into a faltering one in the public eye. And in finance, trust often outweighed cash. Her heels pressed into the carpet, not rushing, not dragging, each step like a count of every word slipping behind her. No one dared say them to her face. Rumors were always birthed from behind because those who spread them feared meeting the eyes of their subject. A group passed by laughing. The moment they saw her, silence fell. Then the subject changed abruptly. But that silence revealed more than their whispers ever could. It was a mirror flashing back the smirk they tried to hide. Nia stopped at the end of the hall before a gilded mirror. The reflection was unmistakable. A black woman in a plain black dress, standing alone, surrounded by smoke-like rumors curling around her. Yet instead of defeat, the mirror returned a gaze sharp as steel. The eyes of someone who knew backstabs only made her sharper. They thought they had landed a mortal blow. But inside Nia, it was only a reminder. The board was being set, and everyone was too confident in their pieces. What they didn't realize was that those triumphant whispers had just exposed a gap. One Nia would soon turn into a blade. She hadn't left the corridor when a figure stepped into her path. A familiar financial reporter notorious for sharp questions spun into headlines. Notebook in hand, pen uncapped, he looked like he was already sharpening his knife. He lifted his chin, a thin smile etched on his lips. "Are you certain Aurora will survive the year?" The word certain was his knife, thrust straight into the gut. Naya studied him. Her gaze didn't move, as though she wasn't considering what to answer, but whether he realized whose role he was playing, journalist or messenger boy for the powerful. The corridor stilled. Passers-by paused, pretending to check phones or tie shoelaces, but in truth, they stayed to watch. Everyone bore the face of expectation, waiting for Nia to flinch, to stumble, to confirm the rumor's truth. The reporter edged closer, pressing harder. "The market says otherwise, Miss Hawthorne. Many believe Aurora's just a dying name." His voice dropped lower, but his eyes lit up, like a hound catching the scent of blood. Nia tilted her head, still silent. Her lack of reply made the question hang heavier than any words could. It cracked his composure. The thin smile faltered. The pen in his hand trembled. He suddenly wondered if he'd just spoken to the wrong person. The corridor held its breath. They wanted fireworks, an outburst, a fight. Instead, silence. A silence so thick the tick of the hallway clock seemed deafening. It wasn't surrender. It was a mirror flipped back at him, forcing the aggressor to see his own desperation. His question, meant as a dagger, now revealed only his side's fear. Nia stepped aside, slipping past him without a word. He turned, startled, realizing his strike had landed in empty air. The hallway buzzed again with footsteps and whispers, but no one dared laugh. They had just seen silence speak, and it unsettled them more than any retort. That night, the ballroom believed Nia was the one being picked apart. But what they didn't see was the woman memorizing every word, every dagger thrown, collecting them as evidence for the counterstroke. Nia paused mid-corridor, her eyes flashing cold. The reporter still stood, pen in hand, but less certain now. He wanted a defense, a denial, or even a crack of fear. Instead, all he received was a steady, unyielding stare. No words. No rushed breath. Just a void that turned the other sounds, the footsteps, the distant laughter, the clinking glasses, into background music for this standoff. Then the unexpected happened. The crowd of eavesdroppers grew uneasy. Some looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Others tugged at their suits, hiding smiles that had nearly formed. Silence, mistaken for weakness, slowly mutated into power, an invisible weight pressing their heads lower. The reporter tried to recover. A dry laugh broke out, brittle and false. I was just asking," he stammered, before retreating like a man who dropped the blade he thought he held. Nia still said nothing. She turned and walked on, leaving behind a silence that lingered like smoke after an explosion. The watchers followed her with eyes flickering between curiosity, fear, and awe, but none spoke. In this world of power, people expected shouting, sparring, words as weapons. Which is why silence became stranger, sharper. It forced others to fill the void with their own fear. And in that moment, they all wondered, had she just lost? Or had she set the stage for a strike no one saw coming? She re-entered the ballroom, her back straight, shoulders cutting through the golden light. Those in the corridor stepped aside instinctively, parting a path like an inverted procession, where the one dismissed was escorted by the very ones who thought themselves above her. Nia sat once more in the last row, eyes blazing. Without a word, she had turned rumor into a mirror of her opponent's weakness. More importantly, she had forced the entire room to ask what was coming next. They didn't know her silence was not the end. It was only the opening note of a symphony whose crescendo had yet to come. Gregory Vale took the stage as if it were his private throne. The lights of the ballroom framed him in a glowing halo, his tall frame wrapped in a polished black tuxedo. His voice boomed deep and steady, like the opening drumbeat of a performance scripted long before. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we witness the dawn of an era led by the companies that matter. The room fell silent at once. Crystal glasses were set down on white-clothed tables, every eye fixed on Gregory. He wasn't just presenting his own company. He was claiming the authority to decide who deserved to exist and who should be erased from the map. From the back row, Nia's gaze never left him. Each of his words sounded less like vision and more like an indictment prepared in advance. He spoke of grand vision, of leaps forward, of leading the future, but between every phrase ran the smirk of a man savoring a kill shot, gloating in his own spotlight. Gregory stepped left, raising a hand toward the giant screen. The first slide lit up. Soaring revenue charts, blue bars rising like mountains under spotlights. The hall erupted in applause. They weren't just clapping for his success, they were clapping for the elegance of how it buried Aurora Group. Then his tone dropped low before swelling again. While certain companies face severe difficulties, we are... He broke off, smiling, letting the laughter roll across the room. He didn't need to say the name. Aurora's absence spoke louder than words. Nia didn't move. Her eyes tracked every gesture, every grin, every gleam on Gregory's silver hair. Her silence no longer a shield, but a test for the entire hall. Would anyone notice the cruelty in this performance? On stage, Gregory spread his arms, voice ringing with pride and disdain. This is what real strength looks like. The audience rose as one, applauding wildly, as though they had just witnessed an unassailable triumph. But in the shadows, Nia's eyes glinted like steel. She knew any stage built too quickly was the easiest to collapse. They cheered, they celebrated, but none realized that in moments their laughter would sour, and the spotlight now bathing Gregory would expose cracks he couldn't hide. He cleared his throat, signaling the next slide. Numbers sprawled across the screen, red bars plunging downward like cracks in old plaster. The bold headline read, Aurora Group, Quarterly Loss Report. He turned, pointing at the figures, his voice ringing. This is the evidence. A company can shout all it wants about diversity, about vision. But when the numbers speak, the truth is smoke. The room roared with laughter. The sound rose like a choir rehearsed to perfection. Applause followed, a drumbeat of mockery. Many turned to the back, where Nia sat, making sure she saw the humiliation displayed like theater. Gregory pressed on, lacing his words with false sympathy. I truly hope Aurora finds a way out, but the market is ruthless, as we know. Not everyone is born to sit at this table. Another round of laughter broke loose, glasses clinking in gleeful harmony. Nia stayed still, her back straight, her hand resting calm on the table, no tremor, no tap. She let the noise wash over her like water hitting stone. Yet behind her composure, her dark eyes flickered with a different light, like a blade hidden in its sheath, waiting for the right draw. Someone nearby leaned over, whispering as if in sympathy. Harsh. But maybe they're right. The words weren't cruel, but they cut deeper. Nia answered only with a slow glance, sharp enough to make him turn away in shame. Gregory swept his hand across the slide. When numbers like these appear, every dream shatters. He paused, letting the room revel in their own applause and whistles, faces flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. But beneath the performance lay a bitter irony few noticed. Those numbers weren't the whole truth. They were crafted, manipulated, as fragile as glass illusions. And the cheering crowd, blind in their certainty, were no more than extras in a stage trick. Gregory believed he had buried Aurora Group for good. What he didn't see was that every shallow stab leaves evidence of cowardice. And that night, the loudest laughter would be the first sound, swallowed by silence rising from the back row. Gregory pressed forward, but the screen behind him suddenly flickered. A static buzz, a stutter of light, the red bars vanished. For a beat, the hall froze. Then, projected across the giant screen, came a new image. Aurora Group. The audience chuckled, scattered, awkward. Laughter this time was fractured like an actor botching his line on stage. Someone near the front sneered, "Even the projector gets confused. Aurora's not worth a slide." A ripple of uneven laughter followed. Gregory stiffened. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Ah, just a technical glitch. Anyway, as you can see..." He gestured quickly, trying to move on, but the screen refused, locked on Aurora's logo. Then images followed. Headquarters gleaming in lights, towers rising steady and strong. A stark counterpoint to the bleeding numbers he'd just paraded. Murmurs spread. This time, not giddy, but uneasy. People began to wonder, was Aurora truly faltering, or was someone staging a narrative? Eyes shifted from the stage to the back, toward Naya. Gregory scowled, waving for the technicians. A staffer rushed to the corner, panic in his movements, but the screen held steady. Aurora glowing bright, unshaken. While Gregory fumbled, Naya sat with arms folded, calm, composed, as if this were all foreseen. Not a twitch of panic, not a word of defense. Her serenity became the perfect mirror to his unraveling. Someone up front whispered, "Maybe Aurora isn't as weak as we thought." The murmur spread, row by row, like sparks catching dry grass. No loudspeakers needed. Rumor alone tilted the room. Gregory banged the mic, forcing his voice louder. "As I said, numbers don't lie." But everyone could hear it. His voice trembled. And when the mountain shakes, you realize it was only sand all along. From the back, Nia tilted her head slightly, eyes gleaming. She hadn't spoken a word, yet Gregory's cracks were plain for all to see. And in that instant, the audience grasped a new truth. Aurora Group had never vanished. Perhaps the first to disappear would be Gregory Vale himself. Gregory Vale strode onto the stage as if it were his private throne. The house lights poured down, haloing his broad figure in a glossy black tux. His voice rolled out, deep, steady, like the opening drum of a show long prearranged. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we witness the era of the true market leaders." The ballroom fell instantly quiet. Crystal glasses touched linen, eyes converged on Gregory. He wasn't just talking about his company, he was appointing himself arbiter of who deserved to exist and who should be erased from the map. From the last row, Nia didn't take her eyes off the stage. Every line he delivered sounded like a pre-written indictment. He spoke of grand vision, leaps forward, and a future leading the market. Threaded through each elegant phrase was something plainer. The relish of a man who believed he'd just landed a perfect blow and was luxuriating in his moment. Gregory moved left, gesturing to the screen behind him. The first slide appeared, soaring revenue numbers, a vertical chart, blue light making the whole thing look like an unassailable peak. The room erupted in applause. They weren't just clapping for success, they were clapping for how neatly it seemed to stamp Aurora Group into the ground. His voice dropped a beat, then climbed. "While some companies are in serious trouble, we..." He paused and smiled, inviting the room to laugh along. They did. No need to say the name. Aurora didn't appear on the screen, but hovered inside every snicker. Nia remained still. She watched each gesture, each smile, each glint of light on Gregory's silver hair. Her silence wasn't a shield anymore, it was a test. Would anyone in here recognize the irony of this performance? On stage, arms wide, his voice boomed, braided with pride and contempt. "This is what real power looks like." The audience rose to their feet, applauding as if a definitive victory had just been witnessed. But in the shadowed back, Naya's eyes flashed like steel. She knew this. Any stage thrown up too quickly is the easiest to collapse. They were laughing, cheering. No one realized that in moments the laughter would curdle into confusion, and the spotlight bathing Gregory would show the cracks no lighting could hide. Gregory cleared his throat and signaled for the next slide. A dense table popped up, crimson columns dropping like fractures through old plaster. The bold header, Aurora Group, quarterly loss report. He stepped aside, hand cutting the air toward the numbers, voice ringing. "This is the evidence. A company can preach diversity, talk vision all at once, but when the numbers speak, The rest is just smoke. Laughter rolled across the room. Loud, rehearsed, orchestral. Applause followed like drum hits punctuating a taunt. Many turned to look at the back row, making sure Nia could see and hear the public shaming. Gregory went on, now dipped in faux sympathy. I truly hope Aurora finds a way out, but you know how brutal the market is. Not everyone is born to sit at this table. Louder laughter, glasses clinking, the ballroom shimmering with ridicule. Nia didn't flinch, spine tall, gaze lifted to the stage, hands still. She let the laughter wash past like water over stone. Behind her composure, her eyes flashed with a different light, blade bright, waiting for the right beat to be drawn. Someone near her leaned in, whispering as if in sympathy, "Hard to hear, but maybe they're right." It wasn't malicious, which somehow made it worse. Nia met the person's eyes, slow, level, and they looked away, flushed. Gregory carved the air over the slide. When the numbers look like this, any dream dissolves. He paused again, letting the cheers and whistles spill over. Faces up front glowed red with wine and triumph. What almost no one saw. The numbers weren't quite truth. They were craft. Mirror trick and angle. The cheering room was an audience to a borrowed illusion. Gregory believed he'd buried Aurora with one clean stab. He didn't know that if a knife doesn't go deep enough, it comes back as proof of cowardice. And that night, beneath the glitter, the loudest laughs would be the first to get swallowed by the quiet gathering in the back row. Gregory was still writing his speech when the screen behind him flickered. A soft buzz. The blood-red columns blinked out. A brief hush. Then a new image filled the screen. The Aurora Group logo. A few chuckles, thin, scattered, as if someone had read the wrong cue card. Projectors confused, someone near the stage sniped. Nothing worth seeing from Aurora, anyway. More scattered laughs rose, enough to make a ripple. Gregory froze for a beat. He cleared his throat, turned toward the screen, trying to paper over the stumble with a stiff joke. Just a technical hiccup. As I was saying... He flicked to move on, but the display stayed on Aurora. Sleek headquarters lit like day. Glass tower steady against the night. The image clashed hard against the red numbers he'd tried to etch into the room's memory. The murmurs changed timbre. Some of the smugness bled out. A question moved through tables. Was Aurora truly weak, or was someone staging a story? Eyes that had been locked on Gregory began to slip backward toward Nia. Gregory frowned, motioned to tech. A staffer hustled to a console, bewilderment plain on his face. The screen held, bright, composed, Aurora arguing its case without a word. While Gregory shuffled, Nia sat with arms lightly folded, serenity itself, as if this pivot had always been part of the plan. No fluster, no speech. Her calm became the perfect counterpoint to Gregory's fraying control. Up front, someone whispered, "Maybe Aurora isn't as bad as we thought." It spread, neighbor to neighbor, table to table. No PA system needed. Whispers are enough to tilt a room. Gregory tapped the mic too hard, voice forced. As I said, numbers don't lie. But now the entire room could feel it. He was rattled. And when a man who fashions himself a mountain begins to tremble, the mountain looks a lot like stacked sand. In the dark of the last row, Nia inclined her head slightly. Without a single rebuttal, she'd let Gregory expose his own fissures. And in that beat, the audience sensed it. Maybe Aurora hadn't vanished at all. Maybe the first to vanish would be Gregory Vale. The PA boomed, snapping the room back to hush. A reporter in the middle row stood, unflinching, voice ringing like a verdict. "Nia, can a black woman CEO truly be big enough to compete at this table?" The question dropped heavy, stone on steel, into the brittle quiet after the projector glitch. The packed hall felt suddenly wide, the words echoing as if they were the only thing left. Every head pivoted to the back. Crystal froze. Half-formed claps died. They watched Nia, not for an answer, but for her collapse under the cleanest, bluntest blow of the night. The reporter didn't blink. Confidence, maybe even glee, shone in his stare. He was certain he'd voiced the room's unspoken line and, by daring to say it, crowned himself the speaker of truth. Whispers reignited. Right. She's never actually sat at this table. Another leaned close. Presents? Sure, but black and a woman? Hard to buy. Small lines, but each pinned sharper edges onto the question hanging in the air. Nia didn't move. Another executive might have scrambled. Awards, numbers, a resume poured like sand. Nia sat straight, face still as a lake at midnight. It was the silence that unsettled them. When someone refuses to answer, people manufacture answers for them. Answers more about their own fears than reality. The reporter repeated slower now, each word cut deliberate. Can a black woman CEO be big enough to compete at this table? The room held its breath. They didn't see it yet, but the silence had already shifted the ground. They were no longer judging her. They were suspended by her. Some questions don't need words. They need something sharper, an act that makes the crowd confront itself. The hall froze, a stage gone still. They waited for a crack for her to rise, shaking, to argue, to flare. They pictured the familiar scene, the cornered outburst. Spotlights framed her like an unwilling lid. Pens hovered. Lenses tightened, ready to capture the last statement of a CEO under siege. The tension hummed so loud someone swallowed audibly. A few up front stretched into their chairs, half smiles creeping in, convinced they were about to watch her break. The reporter stood ready, mic dipping, certain he'd struck a nerve. He waited like a hunter, sure the prey was about to thrash. What shocked them was the length of the quiet. Nia didn't stand. She didn't grab the mic. She sat tall, calm, lips sealed. No sound. The silence spread, washing away the crowd's appetite for spectacle. When a script doesn't play, it's the audience that grows uneasy. A cough, a chair's soft scrape. Instead of fireworks, a question. Why isn't she speaking? Power drifted. He wasn't leading anymore. The laughter had died. Nia, with quiet alone, had pulled them into her gravity. She reached for the tabletop microphone. The room seized. Finally, the defense. The speech, the plea. Her fingers touched it. She lifted it a few inches and let it fall. The clack cracked the air, dry, cold, final. The hall flinched. Gregory laughed first, big, brazen, eager to release the tension. See? He cheered. She doesn't even have an excuse. Laughter followed, thin, papery, tearing at the edges. Listen close and you could hear it. Nerves inside the laughter. That single clack had landed too precisely. It wasn't helplessness. It was intent. An answer disguised as sound. Nia didn't smile, didn't frown. Her eyes stayed forward so steady the room began to itch. If she were broken, why did her gaze still gleam like tempered steel? Another reporter lowered his pen, staring. He understood. Her silence made Gregory's noise feel cheap. She didn't need words. She had already forced them to revolve around what she refused to say. That was power. Gregory kept laughing, but fewer joined him. Faces tilted to whisper. Doubt glittered like hairline cracks in glass. Nia hadn't shouted to save herself. She'd answered with a single deliberate clack, enough to shake the room. And while they soothed themselves with brittle laughter, they missed the point. That sound was the flare. The real storm was only now rolling in. Nia rose to her feet. The entire hall stopped breathing. The chair in the last row still trembled faintly, as if marking the trace of a decision that could not be taken back. Every pair of eyes, every mouth frozen mid-sentence, followed the woman in the black dress as she walked toward the stage. The spotlight poured down, enveloping her, pushing the banquet tables behind into a dim blur. The ballroom split into two worlds. One bathed in light, the faces dazzled and exposed, the other receding into shadow, where the crowd became spectators. Nia moved silently across that borderland between the two. The air thickened, heavy enough that each strike of her heel against the steps rang clear. Clack! 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 The sound echoed, needing no music, carrying the rhythm of the room's heartbeat. Gregory Vale narrowed his eyes, fingers tightening around his glass. He had not expected Nia to walk up. In the script he'd written, she was supposed to remain at the back, silent, reduced to a powerless witness of his ridicule. But now she was stepping into the very light he believed was his alone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. What is she doing? The whispers carried not curiosity but unease. Because when someone cornered still manages to stand, it usually means they have a move no one saw coming. Nia stopped to center stage. The lights framed her face, revealing eyes deep and unreadable. No smile, no frown, only absolute composure. And that composure tightened the room more than any sharp rebuttal could have. The microphone waited on its stand. She didn't rush to take it. She simply placed her hands loosely before her, gaze sweeping the audience. In that instant, many found themselves lowering their eyes as though caught in the act of something shameful. Gregory tried to puncture the tension. He forced a laugh, raising his voice. "Ah, looks like Aurora Group still has something to say." But the joke landed hollow, a wrong note that made the whole symphony wobble. Nia didn't answer. Silence draped the room, thick and stretching, until people began to shift in their seats, hearts racing faster. For when someone in power speaks, they speak endlessly. But when someone holds silence this long, that is the most unnerving kind of control. And in that moment, as every breath waited on Nia, no one knew her silence was only the prelude to a storm. Behind her, the screen lit up. Not graphs, not dry numbers, just a single simple image. Aurora Group's employees standing together, multi-ethnic, multi-generational, their faces lit with unpolished pride. No dazzling lights, no grand stage, just the truth of a shared moment as if taken on an ordinary day. The ballroom erupted in laughter. It thundered up into the high ceiling, a jeer dressed as an echo. From the front row, a man leaned into his table mic, loud enough for all to hear. "This is the strategy? Looks more like a class photo." Waves of laughter followed, rolling, sharp. Another voice, lower, dripping disdain. "She thinks flashing brown faces, immigrants, makes Aurora strong?" The cluster around him laughed harder, eyes fixed on the stage like they were watching a clumsy farce. Gregory Vale leaned back, his smirk widening. He didn't have to say another word. The room was doing his work for him, turning Nia's moment into a collective mockery. Yet Nia remained still. She didn't bow her head, didn't shuffle her notes, didn't show the faintest fluster. Arms lightly crossed, her gaze steady, she stood like someone well used to being made a target. And some began to notice the difference. Because weakness usually sputters, defends, explains, redirects. But Nia wasn't doing any of that. She let the laughter pour over her like rain, unmoved, a stone that would not erode. Her poise made a few eyes falter. A young executive in the third row frowned. If this is naivety, why does she stand so firm? Gregory bent toward a colleague, whispering, "Let her bury herself." But in the depths of his eyes, a flicker of doubt. He'd seen her mocked before, but never watched her turn mockery into a mirror. The laughter thinned. A cough here, a chair shifting there. The crowd had laughed too long at something that no longer felt secure. Nia drew a breath, not to speak, just to mark her own rhythm. Her eyes swept across the room, saying without words, "You laugh, but you don't realize what you just missed." And suddenly the silence after the laughter became dangerous. Because once laughter dries up, only curiosity remains. Curiosity about what lies behind that disarmingly simple photo. The room grew heavier. Some frowned. If it was a mistake, why wasn't she trying to recover? If it was the end, why wasn't she trembling? Gregory tapped his glass, waiting for a crack for panic. But the longer he looked, the more unsettled he felt. She wasn't acting like someone who'd made herself a joke. She was a conductor, standing still, letting the orchestra stumble until the time came to drop the baton. A woman near him muttered, "She's been quiet too long." Gregory forced a chuckle. Quiet because she has nothing left. But even he heard it as self-comfort, not scorn. On stage, the light etched her stillness. The faint smile on her lips deepened into a challenge. You think you've won, but your glee is proof of how fragile you are. A small cough cracked the air, then the squeak of a chair. The room shifted restlessly. Those who'd laughed the loudest now found themselves staring at their glasses. Nia's silence wasn't a reaction. It was a tactic. Held long enough, silence turns into a mirror, forcing others to see the emptiness in their own noise. Gregory gripped his glass harder, drawing a breath. He wasn't laughing anymore. He could feel it. She had stolen the rhythm. He thought he was steering the room, but it was her silence that held them. And then it happened. The laughter was gone. The audience no longer jeered. They waited, eyes strained forward, certain that when this silence broke, it would break like thunder. Nia didn't hurry. Her smile held. Her gaze stayed calm. But calm now felt like pressure, the storm packed tight, seconds from release. The whole room understood. They were used to shouting, to argument, to noise. But this time, the thing that unnerved them most was the absence of sound. And when that storm finally broke, no one in the hall would remain standing the way they were before. The air inside the hall had thickened like a heavy fog. Every gaze fixed on Nia, waiting for what they believed was inevitable. A public suicide. To them, simply stepping onto that stage was already her grave. That diverse workforce slide had been in their minds nothing more than shooting herself in the foot. Now they thought all that remained was her slow collapse into ridicule. Gregory Vale sipped his wine, his smile stretching wider, his eyes glittering with triumph. He leaned toward an ally beside him and murmured, "Wait. She'll expose her weakness herself. The longer she stands, the clearer it becomes." His voice wasn't loud, but the smugness traveled like an echo, prompting others nearby to smirk in agreement. Nia stood in the light, silent. She didn't rush to change slides, didn't bow her head and gather her notes as they hoped. She only stood tall, that unreadable smile lingering, her eyes piercing through the walls of arrogance before her. The room grew restless. A few coughs broke out, chairs scraped against the floor, a restless little symphony of impatience. To wait for a collapse and not see it was, in truth, more unsettling than watching one happen. The reporter in the middle row held his pen poised like a knife, ready for the final cut. He imagined his headline already. Black female CEO fails on billionaire stage. Others thought the same. They believed if they sat still long enough, Nia would stage her own humiliation for their delight. But what Nia radiated was nothing of the sort. Her calm wasn't the stillness of collapse, it was the composure of a card player waiting to lay down her ace. The crowd began to feel themselves drawn into an unnamed game. The jeers from minutes earlier had faded completely, replaced by a silence taut as a lake before a storm. They didn't know what she would do, and it was the not knowing that made their hearts beat faster. Gregory scowled, realizing the atmosphere no longer obeyed him. He forced a laugh, loud and brittle. "Well then, let's see what's next. Surely you've got another trick up your sleeve?" A few half-hearted chuckles followed, but no one truly joined in. Nia looked slowly around the hall. Her eyes swept over every face, pausing just a fraction longer on Gregory before returning to the screen behind her. And as she reached toward the clicker to change the slide, the entire room leaned forward like an audience waiting for the gun on the wall, hung there all evening to finally fire. They didn't know that moment would open an entirely different chapter, where the man who thought he held all the control would be the one exposed. The screen behind her shifted. The light changed color. A new slide flashed up, sharp and undeniable. Gone was the Aurora staff photo. Gone was the laughter. In its place appeared a logo so familiar it burned the eyes. Vale Corporation. Gregory Vale's pride, his empire, his throne for decades. A ripple of gasps ran across the room. People sat upright, craning their necks to see. For a heartbeat, they thought it must be a mistake, some technical glitch. But then, beneath the logo, words appeared, clean and sharp as a blade. Official acquisition by Aurora Group. And beneath those words, clear and unshakable, signatures of confirmation. The hall exploded, but not in applause. It was gasps, the scrape of chairs, fragmented whispers. Hands flew to mouths. Executives who had laughed the loudest now stared wide-eyed, as if witnessing a piece of impossible magic. Gregory Vale froze. The smile stuck to his face, warped into something grotesque. His wine glass trembled, spilling red across the tablecloth. He opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. No sound came. The reporter in the middle row gaped at the screen, pen slipping from his hand, clattering to the floor. One question hammered in his head. Since when? How? This was no rumor, no parody. This was a real transaction, stamped and sealed. A young businessman whispered, "Impossible. Vale Corporation was untouchable." But the words on the screen blazed on, each pixel a proclamation no one could erase. Nia stood on stage, arms folded, gaze calm as she swept the hall. She spoke no words. She needed none. The slide said it all, and her silence only made the blow land heavier. Gregory staggered to his feet, but his legs felt nailed to the ground. He had built the evening to bury Nia, and now found himself stripped bare in the very light he thought was his. Chaos broke loose. Those who had sneered at Nia began trading uneasy glances, recalculating allegiances. A few snapped photos, desperate to capture evidence of this historic turn. And in the midst of the uproar, Nia's serene smile became pure satire. It seemed to whisper, "You thought I was self-destructing. Turns out the only one who fell was your king." What no one yet realized was that this shock was only the beginning. For the next slide would reveal a secret that would tilt the balance of power even further. The ballroom erupted again. Chairs scraped, voices overlapped, camera flashes burst like lightning. Some people leapt to their feet, disbelieving. Vale Corporation, the untouchable empire, now glared down at them as Aurora's prize. Gregory Vale went pale. He tried to force a smile, but his trembling lips only twisted his face further. Hands that once lifted expensive wine glasses clenched into fists, veins rising. The wave of shock spread. It wasn't just that Aurora had silently taken Vale Corporation. It was that the slander campaign against Nia had been orchestrated by Vale himself. And now his name shone across the screen, not as a Titan's, but as a trophy. Then another name appeared in the chaos. Harold Dempsey. Gregory's senior aide, his right hand for years. The one who had signed the acquisition papers selling Vale to Aurora Group. The hall erupted a second time. Every eye swung toward Harold, seated in the front. He rose slowly, unnervingly calm. No longer the loyal deputy, he looked like a blade unsheathed, gleaming and cold. Gregory's eyes bulged, betrayal cutting deeper than the deal itself. He stammered, "Harold, well, it can't be, you—" But Harold only shrugged, lips curling into a cruel smile. "Every empire falls, Gregory. I just chose to stand with the future." The hall went dead quiet. No one knew what to be more stunned by, the acquisition itself or the betrayal from within. The irony was vicious. Vale had spent the night stabbing at Nia only to be stabbed by his own hand. Nia stood in the spotlight, silent. She didn't need to direct anything. The play unfolded itself, and she was its unseen director. Her silence now thundered louder than applause. A smattering of claps began, hesitant, then swelling. Not applause for Gregory's collapse, but for the spectacle of the rules being rewritten before their eyes. Gregory sank into his chair, eyes hollow, his arrogance gone. Only one truth remained. The man he trusted most had opened the gates for Aurora to walk in. And the hall understood. The jeering of Naya at the start of the night had only been the prologue. The real storm had only just begun. Gregory Vale sat frozen, his face pale as wax beneath the blazing golden lights. Sweat dotted his forehead, hollow eyes fixed on the screen behind Nia, where the Vale Corporation logo still blazed beneath the words, "Acquisition by Aurora Group." The room buzzed with murmurs, but to Gregory it all collapsed into a heavy, muffled drone. He drew in a shaky breath and forced himself to stand. The commanding posture of a billionaire emperor was gone. His back bent, his hand limp at his side, red drops of wine dripping onto the carpet. Step by step he moved toward the stage, where Nia still stood, calm and unshaken, like a statue that somehow breathed. Gregory stopped in the light, his face contorting as he tried to force a smile. It was no longer arrogant, it was desperate, trembling, the last scrap of dignity clung to. His voice rasped, breaking, "But let's cooperate, shall we?" He extended a hand, trembling. Fingers that had once crushed the most powerful handshakes now locked stiff, suspended in the air. The entire room watched, breathless. A few journalists raised their cameras, knowing this would be a historic frame, the handshake between the one once rejected and the one now begging for recognition. Nia looked at the hand, her expression unreadable. The room froze. Everyone assumed she would take it. That was the logical script, the expected ending, the handshake of forgiveness, the civilized curtain call. But in the back row where the servers stood, their eyes glimmered differently. They had seen it all tonight, from the first refused handshake to Nia's silent defiance. They knew she was not someone who followed the script written for the powerless. Gregory's hand still hung there, trembling in the light. Seconds dragged into eternity. The waiting became torture. Not just for him, but for the entire hall. They realized the truth. It was Nia's silence that commanded the room. She tilted her head slightly. Just a small movement, but the front row shuddered. That tilt was an unspoken question. Do I even need this hand? Gregory swallowed hard, his hand still outstretched, growing heavier with each passing second. No one laughed anymore, no one jeered. Only silence pressing down like a scar across the room. And in that moment, they all understood. Sometimes the handshake that doesn't happen leaves a scar louder than 100 that do. The hall went utterly still. Even breath seemed trapped in chess. Every eye followed Naya as she stepped down from the podium, slow, steady strides toward Gregory. Each heel strike against the marble floor echoed like a judge's gavel. Measured, commanding, final. Gregory's hand quivered in the air, fragile as a leaf in the wind. Once he had refused her handshake, humiliating her before hundreds. Now he was pleading for hers, as if that single touch was the only rope left keeping him from the abyss. Nia didn't rush. She advanced calmly, eyes never leaving that hand suspended in midair. The silence grew so thick that each of her steps stretched it further, a taut line ready to snap. The crowd leaned forward. Cameras clicked, waiting to capture what they thought must come. The historic reconciliation. Executives whispered, "This is it. The logical ending. She'll take his hand, and it will all be packaged as a civilized act." But in the back rows, the servers' eyes told another story. They weren't waiting for a handshake. They were waiting to see if Naya would shatter the unwritten law that the marginalized must always accept the hand of power, even when it once turned away. Gregory shifted nervously, his hand stretching further, palm up, slick with sweat. The gesture only deepened the room's anxiety. No one wanted the waiting to go on, but all were trapped in the game of silence that Nia controlled. She stopped, just steps from him. Their eyes locked. His stripped bare by fear, hers calm and sharp as a blade against the cracked mask of his authority. A cough sounded from the front row, then vanished. No one dared interrupt. The room was suffocating with anticipation, the ticking clock on the wall loud as a drum. Nia tilted her head again, lips pressed tight. Without a word, the room knew. This would not be the reasonable ending they had imagined. Now, they weren't just waiting for a handshake. They were waiting for the overturn, the final satire in a game where they themselves had been led by the nose from the very beginning. Nia stood before Gregory. The entire room held its breath. His hand still trembled, dangling in the light, paper thin, about to be carried off by the air. Every person waited for the contact, the closure, the symbol they could later call reconciliation. Nia glanced at the hand, briefly. Not long, not short. Just enough to make the waiting unbearable. Then she lifted her gaze, steady and direct, and walked past Gregory as if he were a statue of no consequence. No handshake, no words. Her heels struck the marble floor, each step sharp, echoing in the dead silence. Gregory's hand remained hanging there, unanswered. His face blanched as he slowly lowered it, a man who had just grasped at nothing. The room trembled, not with laughter, but with the raw exposure of truth. The man who once denied her hand now stood abandoned, his humiliation sealing the circle. The arc had closed, but it closed with cruel satire. Gregory collapsed back into his chair, his face stripped of its mask. The businessmen nearby avoided his gaze, afraid to touch the shame now clinging to him. A few journalists kept snapping photos, but in the heavy silence the clicks sounded like nails hammered into a coffin. Nia walked on, unhurried, her back straight. She didn't need to look back. She knew she had done the one thing no one expected, and it was the shock of that refusal that unbalanced the entire room. A handshake could be forgiven, forgotten in time. But a calm, public rejection, that would be etched into memory forever. Whispers broke out. She just did what no one ever dared. Another voice murmured, that wasn't just a refusal of Gregory. That was a refusal of the unjust law itself. And indeed, the echo of that moment reached far beyond the ballroom. It left a haunting question. How many black hands had been ignored in silence? How many times had they smiled and extended their hand again, as if nothing happened? And how many more would find the courage to turn away, letting refusal finally belong to them? The room remained still. No one rushed to leave. They all felt it, the storm that hadn't screamed, but had swept away the old order. And from that moment on, they understood. Sometimes the handshake that never happens resounds longer than any ever captured in a flash of cameras. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.